This is the story of Marcus Hale and his wife Lydia Harper. They had built something quiet and sturdy together. 7 years of shared grocery lists, inside jokes that had lost their punchlines but not their warmth, and the particular comfort of knowing exactly how the other person takes their coffee. What neither of them had fully reckoned with was the third presence in their marriage, Marcus's mother Diane, who had never quite accepted that her son had chosen a woman who did not need her approval. The tension lived below the surface, the way water damage hides inside walls invisible until the structure begins to shift. This is a story about what happens when love is not enough to protect itself, and when trust, once questioned, reveals how quietly it had already been eroding. The kitchen smelled like burned toast and rosemary, which was how most of their Sunday mornings began. Lydia stood at the counter scraping char off a slice of sourdough while Marcus read something on his phone at the table, his coffee growing cold in the way she had long since stopped mentioning. Outside, October had arrived without ceremony, gray light through the windows. A few leaves stuck to the glass from last night's wind. "Your mother called again," Lydia said, not turning around. "I know, I saw. She wants to come for Thanksgiving." A pause, the kind that had texture. "I'll call her back," Marcus said. Lydia set the toast on a plate and brought it to the table, sitting across from him. He glanced up, smiled a real smile, not performed, and reached over to steal a corner of her toast without asking. She let him. This was marriage. The small thefts, the permissions granted without words. They had met at a friend's going-away party 11 years ago, married 4 years after that, and had spent the intervening years building a life that looked from the outside like something assembled by people who knew what they were doing. They had a house in a quiet neighborhood outside Portland, 2 cats named after minor Roman emperors, and a habit of narrating the internal monologues of strangers they observed in restaurants. They were good together. They had learned each other's rhythms the way you learn a language, slowly, imperfectly, but with genuine fluency. What they had not learned was how to talk about Diane. Marcus's mother was a woman of precise opinions and generous affection, and she distributed both without regard for whether they were wanted. She had welcomed Lydia into the family the way one welcomes a guest who is overstayed with diminishing warmth and increasing passive suggestions about departure. It was never overt. Diane was too careful for overt. She asked questions instead of making statements. She offered help in ways that implied incompetence. She told Marcus often how much she worried about him, and the worry was genuine enough that it served as camouflage for something less generous beneath it. Lydia had made peace with this, or something that resembled peace. She kept her feelings about Diane in a place that was organized rather than suppressed. She knew they were there. She simply did not take them out often. She mentioned a recipe, Marcus said, still looking at his phone, for the stuffing. She said she could come early and help. "She's welcome to visit," Lydia said carefully. "I just need to know the dates." "Right." He set the phone down finally and looked at her. "You okay?" "I'm fine." It was true and it wasn't. Lydia was a graphic designer who worked from home 3 days a week, and she had the particular self-awareness of someone who spent a lot of time alone with her own thoughts. She knew that fine was a word she used when she didn't want to begin something she wasn't sure she could finish. Marcus knew this too. He nodded in the way that acknowledged the gap without crossing it. This was also marriage, knowing which silences to leave alone. They spent the rest of the morning in comfortable parallel Marcus at his desk, reviewing quarterly reports for the architecture firm, Lydia sketching layout concepts for a client rebrand, the cats circulating between them like small, indifferent diplomats. They had lunch together and watched 20 minutes of a documentary about deep-sea fish before Marcus fell asleep on the couch, and Lydia covered him with the throw blanket without waking him. She stood there for a moment, looking at him. He looked younger when he slept. He was 41 and carried his age in his jaw and around his eyes, but in sleep his face relaxed into something closer to the man she had met at that party, standing in a kitchen with a paper cup of bad wine, making her laugh about something she couldn't remember now. She had thought then, "This one is worth the trouble." She still thought so. She just hadn't said it aloud in a while. That evening, Diane called again. Marcus took the call in the other room, and Lydia heard the low murmur of his voice, but not the words, which was how it often went. When he came back, he was holding his phone loosely, looking at nothing in particular. "She's thinking of coming the weekend before Thanksgiving," he said. "Okay. If that's okay with you." I said, "Okay, Marcus." He looked at her. She looked at her laptop screen. It was such a small moment, the kind that doesn't register as significant until much later, when you're reassembling the timeline and trying to understand where things began to slide. The shift was gradual enough that Lydia almost missed it. Marcus had always been a man of consistent rhythms, home by 6:30, affectionate in an undemonstrative way, reliable in the specific manner of someone who had decided early in life that reliability was a form of love. He kissed her hello when he came through the door. He remembered the things she mentioned in passing. He was present in the way that mattered, which is to say that when she spoke, he listened. November arrived and he stopped kissing her hello. It wasn't dramatic. There was no slammed door, no cold shoulder announced with theatrical silence. He simply came home and set down his bag and went to change his clothes, and by the time she registered the absence of the greeting, the moment had passed, and it felt too strange to mention. Maybe he was tired. She mentioned it to no one, not even to herself. Not really. Then there was the phone. He had never been secretive with his phone. They weren't the type of couple who monitored each other, who checked over shoulders or borrowed passcodes. But she began to notice him setting it face down on the table when she walked into a room. A glance up and then down, a slight tightening of his posture. She noticed. She filed it away. Diane came for Thanksgiving as planned, arriving on the Wednesday with an enormous casserole dish and the kind of energy that filled a room before she'd fully entered it. She hugged Lydia with genuine warmth. Diane was never cold, that was the thing, and commented on how wonderful the house looked, which was true, and how tired Lydia seemed, which was also meant to be true in a different sense than it landed. The 3 days of the visit passed in the way they always did. Meals and conversation, and an undercurrent that Lydia had learned to move through like weather. Diane helped in the kitchen with the particular efficiency of someone demonstrating how it should be done. She and Marcus talked easily, the way people do when they share a language that predates you. And Lydia sat at the edges of those conversations with a smile that was perfectly calibrated. On the last evening, Lydia came downstairs for water and stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Marcus and Diane were in the living room, speaking quietly. She heard her name. She heard the word worried. She did not hear what followed because Marcus's voice dropped, and she chose not to stand in a hallway listening to a conversation she hadn't been invited to join. She went back to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the sound of her own breathing and thought. With the particular clarity that arrives at 2 in the morning, something is happening. After Diane left, the distance between them settled in like a change of season present everywhere but impossible to locate at its source. Marcus was not unkind. He was not cold. He was just slightly elsewhere. At dinner, he answered her questions fully, but did not ask his own. In bed, he was on his phone longer than usual, and when she put her hand on his arm, he covered it with his briefly before turning over. She tried to talk to him on a Tuesday evening in early December, standing in the kitchen after dinner, the dishwasher running. "You've been somewhere else lately," she said. He turned from the counter. "What do you mean?" "I don't know how to explain it better than that. You've been not here." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It was not guilt, or not only guilt. It was something more complicated. "I've had a lot on my mind," he said. "Work stuff." "Okay. But it feels like more than work." A pause. He opened his mouth, closed it. "Marcus." "I'm fine," he said. I've been thinking about some things." "About what things?" He looked at the floor. I don't know how to." He stopped again. "Then, never mind. I'm going to head to bed." She watched him leave the kitchen. She stood there for a long moment, and then she turned to the window above the sink, and she looked at her own reflection in the dark glass, and something in her face shifted, very slightly, as though she'd become suddenly conscious of being observed. She said quietly, almost to herself, "I don't know. Maybe like, follow this or subscribe or something." The refrigerator hummed. The dishwasher clicked into its rinse cycle. Lydia blinked, pressing 2 fingers to her temple. The strangeness of the moment passed like a ripple, leaving only the kitchen and the dark window and the fact that her husband had, again, walked away from a conversation she needed him to stay in. She was not angry yet. She was still in the part of it where you try to find the rational explanation. She was still, at this point, willing to believe she was imagining things. She was not imagining things. She found the screenshots on a Sunday morning in January, and the finding of them was almost accidental. Marcus had left his laptop open on the kitchen table, stepped out to get the mail, and Lydia set a mug of coffee next to it without looking at the screen. Then she looked at the screen. It was his email, and the thread visible in the preview pane was a conversation with his mother, and the subject line read simply, "What I told you." She did not open the email. She sat down. She was not a woman who acted on first impulse, and the impulse she felt in that moment was not to read it, but to close the laptop and wait and think. She closed the laptop. She drank her coffee. When Marcus came back inside with the mail and a complaint about the cold, she said nothing about what she'd seen. Instead, she started paying attention. She had always been good at pattern recognition. It was part of what made her effective at design, and she began applying that skill to the architecture of the last 2 months. The dates, the behaviors, the way Diane's visit had been the hinge point. She thought about the face-down phone, the incomplete sentences, the particular quality of Marcus's guilt when she looked at him directly. And then, with the careful patience of someone who does not want to be wrong, she began to investigate. It took her 3 weeks to understand what had happened. The first piece came from a message Marcus had accidentally left open on his phone while it was charging a screenshot forwarded from Diane. Purportedly a photo of Lydia outside a restaurant with a man Lydia had never seen. The photo was taken from a distance, grainy, circumstantial, but forwarded with the message from Diane that read, "I didn't want to say anything, but I thought you should know." The second piece came from her own memory. She had not been downtown that weekend. She had been at her parents' house in Salem, 3 hours away. The third piece, the one that turned suspicion into certainty, came from her laptop and from a professional habit she had developed years ago when a client had disputed ownership of design files. She checked metadata. The photo Diane had sent Marcus had been edited. Not crudely, whoever had done it was competent. But the timestamp in the original file's metadata did not match the date attached to it. And when Lydia enlarged the image and examined the background, she found a storefront whose signage she recognized. The restaurant had closed 18 months ago. The photo could not have been taken when Diane claimed. She sat with this for 3 days before she said anything to Marcus. When she did, it was a Wednesday evening, and she did not raise her voice. She set her laptop on the coffee table in front of him and said, "I need you to look at something." He looked. She showed him the photo, then the metadata analysis, then a second edited screenshot, what appeared to be a flirtatious message from Lydia to an unknown contact that contained a fond inconsistency in the timestamp that Lydia's designer's eye had caught, and that she had verified by pulling the original from her own device. Finally, she showed him security footage from their building's parking garage, time-stamped from the same weekend as one of the alleged incidents, showing Lydia's car stationary for the full duration she claimed to have been home. Marcus said nothing for a long time. "She thought I was going to leave you," Lydia said. She was not crying. She had passed through that 2 days ago. "I don't know exactly when she decided to do something about it, but she did. This isn't." He stopped. "I know it's hard. She's my mother, Lydia." "I know." He put his elbows on his knees and pressed his hands to his face and stayed there. She watched him. She did not reach for him, and she did not speak, and she did not soften what she had shown him. She had spent 6 weeks being quietly, methodically careful with this, and she was not going to cushion the moment it landed. "I believed her," he said finally. The words came out quietly, like something that cost him. "I know," Lydia said. I didn't come to you. I just..." "No, you didn't." He looked up at her. His eyes were wet. "What do you want me to do?" She thought about it honestly before she answered. I want you to understand what happened. Both things, what she did and what you did. He nodded very slowly and looked back at the laptop screen. He did not ask her to forgive him that night. She respected him for it. The months that followed were not a restoration. They were something harder and more honest than that. Marcus called his mother the day after the conversation with Lydia. Lydia was not in the room for it, and he did not give her a transcript afterward, and she did not ask for one. She heard him on the phone for a long time, and at one point she heard his voice break, and she stood in the hallway outside the closed door and felt the particular grief of watching someone you love do something difficult that you cannot help them with. Diane's response, when Marcus eventually relayed it, was not a confession. It was a reframe. She had been worried. She had perhaps made some poor choices in how she expressed that worry. The photos had been taken out of context. The messages had been misunderstood. She was sorry if she had caused any pain. But Marcus needed to understand that everything she did because she loved him. Marcus did not accept this. That was the thing that surprised Lydia, and then made her ashamed of her surprise, that she had expected him to capitulate, and he did not. I told her she manipulated me, he said one evening. I told her that what she did was a deliberate attempt to end my marriage, and that I needed time before I could speak to her again. Lydia turned her coffee cup in her hands. How did she take it? She cried. He paused. I let her cry, and then I said it again. This was not who Lydia had understood Marcus to be in relation to his mother. She had spent years watching him navigate Diane's needs with the exhausted diplomacy of someone who had never quite been given permission to disappoint her. Whatever had shifted in him, she could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way he looked directly at her when he spoke now, in the absence of that slight, chronic apology in his manner. And yet, trust is not a switch. It is a practice, and they had been practicing it badly. And the truth was that Lydia could not unknow that her husband had, for 2 months, believed the worst of her without asking. He had grown distant without seeking explanation. He had received evidence from his mother and processed it privately in silence, while Lydia stood next to him in their kitchen wondering what she'd done wrong. She thought about this often, not with anger. Anger had a shape and a peak, and this was not that. It was more like a low-grade audit of the relationship, a re-examination of the architecture she'd thought she understood. What did it mean that he hadn't asked? What did it say about how he saw her, or how he saw himself within the marriage? She was not without her own accounting. She had been private about her feelings regarding Diane for years, had built a careful composure that was professionally maintained enough to look like resolution. Maybe he had read that composure as indifference, as the detachment of someone who didn't fully invest. Maybe she had managed herself into a version of emotional unavailability she hadn't recognized as such. She told him this in March, sitting on the back porch with the door closed and 2 glasses of wine between them. She did not frame it as exculpation. She was not interested in distributing blame so that it became weightless. She framed it as what it was, her own contribution to a marriage in which 2 people had gradually stopped telling the truth about the smaller things, and then been unprepared when the larger things arrived. He listened carefully. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he said, I think I made it easy for her because it was easier than asking you. What do you mean? She gave me a reason for the distance I was already feeling. He stopped, turned the wine glass in his hands. I didn't want to know what was actually wrong with us. So when she gave me something concrete to point at, I let it be that. The honesty of it was uncomfortable. She appreciated the discomfort. They went to therapy in April, not because the marriage was falling apart, but because they were both clear-eyed enough to see that they had been coasting on the good years and had not developed the muscles for this kind of weight. Their therapist, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Ellison, had the quality of seeming unsurprised by everything, which was what they needed. Marcus's relationship with Diane remained suspended. He did not cut contact permanently. Lydia never asked him to, and he never offered it as a gesture she had to accept or refuse. What he did was establish, for the first time in his adult life, a condition for that relationship, honesty, or at least the end of deliberate dishonesty. Whether Diane could meet that condition remained to be seen. Lydia watched him navigate it. She watched him carry the grief of it. Because he did grieve, and the grief was real. And she did not mistake it for weakness or ambivalence. He was mourning a version of his mother he had needed to believe in, and that mourning was appropriate. She did not make him choose between them. She had once thought, if it ever came to that moment, she would need him to choose. She had imagined it would feel like a verdict on her worth. What she found instead was that the choosing wasn't the point. The point was whether he could see clearly, whether he could hold the truth without flinching. She thought he could. She was still deciding if that was enough. It was October again when Diane came to the house. Lydia hadn't known she was coming. Marcus had mentioned, carefully and with the caution of someone handling something fragile, that his mother had asked to visit. Not to stay. Just an afternoon. He said, only if you're comfortable. Lydia had said, I'll be here. She'd spent the morning not preparing for it. She did her work, answered emails, fed the cats. She was not performing equanimity. She was genuinely quieter in herself than she'd been a year ago, and she recognized this as something not healing, exactly, but a settling. The way ground settles after a disturbance and becomes, eventually, load-bearing again. Diane arrived at 1 o'clock. She was dressed carefully, which meant she was nervous, and she carried a small tin of butter cookies that she extended toward Lydia like an offering made to a figure whose approval she was uncertain of. Lydia accepted it, set it on the counter, offered coffee. The three of them sat in the living room with their cups, and it was strange, and it was uncomfortable, and no one pretended otherwise. Diane looked older, not dramatically. It had only been a year. But the months had been a particular kind of hard, and it showed. She sat with her hands around her mug and her posture slightly collapsed inward, like a building with some of the structural confidence removed. I've wanted to speak with you, she said to Lydia finally. I've started this. She stopped. I've drafted some version of this conversation many times. Lydia waited. I'm not here to explain myself, Diane said. Marcus told me you have no interest in my explanations. And I think that's fair. I wanted you to know that I understand what I did. A pause. Not why I did it. I think I understand why I did it. But I mean what it was. What it actually was. What was it? Lydia asked. Diane met her eyes. It was a lie, told by someone who was frightened and who didn't examine her own fear closely enough. The room was quiet. One of the cats jumped onto the couch and walked across Diane's lap, and she put her hand on it automatically, the way people do. I'm not asking for anything, Diane said. I want to be clear about that. I don't expect. She shook her head slightly. I don't have expectations. Lydia looked at her for a long moment. She thought about 7 years of careful, contained dinners. She thought about standing in the hallway outside the closed door listening to Marcus's voice break. She thought about 3 weeks of metadata and timestamps and the particular loneliness of gathering evidence against your own life. I know you love him, Lydia said. Diane's expression shifted. Something opened in it. I do. I know that's true. I've always known that. Lydia set her coffee cup down. I also know that love isn't an explanation, and it isn't a permission. Diane nodded. She didn't try to add to it. Marcus, who had been largely silent, was looking at his hands in his lap. He looked up then at his wife, and there was something in his face that Lydia had not seen in a long time. Not adoration, not gratitude, but something quieter and more durable. Recognition. The look of someone who finally sees the person in front of him at actual size. Diane left an hour later. She hugged Marcus at the door a long one, neither of them speaking, and then she turned to Lydia and hesitated, and Lydia stepped forward and let herself be hugged. Not warmly. Not coldly. Honestly. She stood in the doorway and watched Diane walk to her car. Watched the car pull out of the driveway. Watched the street return to ordinary stillness. Marcus came to stand beside her. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. They stood there for a while in the October light, not touching, not quite. The same month as the beginning of it, the same gray quality to the sky, a few leaves on the glass. "Are we okay?" he asked. Not the way people ask when they expect the answer to be yes. The way they ask when they genuinely don't know. Lydia thought about the question. About what okay meant now. And whether it meant the same thing it had meant before. And whether she wanted it to. "I think we're something," she said. He turned his head to look at her. "I think we're in the middle of figuring out what we are," she said. "I think that's different from okay. I don't know yet if it's better or worse." He nodded slowly. "That's honest." "I'm trying to be honest with you." She paused. "I need you to be honest with me." "I'm trying, I know." The door was still open. The cold was coming in. Neither of them moved to close it. There was no resolution waiting on the other side of the afternoon, no restoration of the thing they'd had before. Because the thing they'd had before had, it turned out, contained the conditions for what had happened. You couldn't restore that and call it repair. What they were building now was something else, and it had no name yet, and it might not last. And they both understood this in the particular way that adults understand difficult things. Not fully, not without resistance, but genuinely. Lydia reached out and closed the front door. She turned back to the living room, the couch, the cats, the ordinary architecture of their life together, and she stood at the edge of it for a moment before she walked into it. Marcus followed her in,